So, I want to ask just like kind of, you mentioned with like longevity of esports, that continuity being important.
Yeah.
What do you think are some things that we have left away from the Quake days, from the Counter-Strike days, from those early days of FPS, even Duke 3D, that like regeneration of health, right? Or you can just go hide and your health regenerates now, instead of health being pickups.
Yeah.
Are there games? Do you think there are mechanics like that could be brought back to games? Do you think that some of those we've made it almost too easy?
Too easy, yeah. I know, because it seems like a lot of games these days, they kind of pander to the casual players who really don't have the patience of when they get shot, they want their health to regenerate. But actually, it's kind of interesting. I do see a lot of games kind of going away from that as well. Like Battlefield doesn't have regenerating health.
Yeah.
Like PUBG, like a lot of these battle royale games, you have to heal yourself.
Yeah.
So I do think that games are becoming a bit more realistic and less casual. I mean, you still have Fortnite, which is, in my mind, is one of the most casual FPS games today.
It's not even first person.
Yeah, exactly, which is another reason why it appeals to such a large player base. Third person is much more appealing.
And it's also easy to sell backpacks when you're looking at your backpack.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a big reason why it's third person.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm just kind of curious. You've been a game developer for a long time. How has the experience changed from when you were first starting out to developing a game in modern times?
Yeah, well, in this day and age, it's harder to take risks because the game industry is so crowded. It is so competitive, and you can't really try to make a risky game or like a game that's so different than the norm, because it'll be harder for you to market your game to a new player. Because I think a lot of players, they kind of gravitate towards games that they can sort of say, oh, this game is sort of like this game, but it's it's kind of the same. Because I think that's I think that was one of my failures with my previous game when I made Tactical Intervention. I think I made that game too weird and too different, and I had a lot of game elements that weren't really seen in other games. And I remember one of the biggest complaints that I had from my players that play that game was whenever they would start some of the missions, they had absolutely no idea what to do, and they were like, what's going on? What's going on? Because I had this one gameplay mode where you would start in these cars, and the cars would chase the other enemy team cars, and there was no other game that did that. And a lot of the players that would play that game mode, they got really frustrated, and they got really like, I don't get this game. This is nothing like they cannot relate that experience to another game. So we lost a lot of players because of that learning curve that they didn't. A lot of the players didn't want to put the time into learning that new game mode. So I think it's hard for game developers to make a game that's too far from the norm.
You need those universal mechanics, so to speak.
Yeah.
So everyone can kind of understand it, like kind of speak the same language, if you will.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's kind of why it's easier to make a clone. Like when for example, like when PUBG became popular, it was kind of easy for Fortnite to take those gameplay mechanics and just kind of do a slight refinement on them, and and it allowed players to kind of relate to. So players that played PUBG can go play Fortnite, and they can sort of say, oh, there's a lot of kind of the similar aspects to it, So yeah, I think in this day and age, whenever you make a new game, I think it's important not to stray too far from the existing formulas. If you are going to make a really new game experience, it's important to start small, and like I think start as a small mod and kind of like build the player base slowly. I think that's kind of what we did with Rust when I worked on a game with my previous company called Face Punch. When we made Rust, I remember Rust, it started out as a small little game with very few players, and a lot of the players were very hardcore and dedicated. But the gameplay was so different than what that was currently out there. It was just this open world survival type game It was, I guess you can say it was sort of like DayZ, which was another game out there at the same time. But it had a lot of these other elements. It combined RPG with FPS, and it was really different. And I think we experimented with a lot of new game mechanics as well. So, but because it was so different, the game grew a bit slower. Like it took maybe 2 or 3 years for it to reach like the critical mass that it's kind of reached right now. Like right now, it has some of the highest player numbers it has compared to what it was like three or 4 years ago when Rust was first introduced. So I think if a game is going to really be innovative and really kind of stray from the norm, like a game like Rust, it has to grow at a pretty slow rate, and it has to kind of grow like with the community involvement at the very early onset. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned starting with a mod, you know, like CS started off as a mod.
And also like PUBG started off as a mod, like the guy who made it. It was actually a mod of you know, H1Z1 or something, right? Yeah. So, and that allows the developer to experiment and to get feedback from the community. When you start off as a mod, nobody's expecting the game to be big or nobody's expecting it to be so, you know, a certain type of game. It allows the developer to just kind of work in an open environment with the players and sort of see what works and what doesn't work, and it allows him to kind of shape the game from there. And that's kind of what I think that's what the guy who made PUBG did, and that's exactly how we made Counter-Strike. It just started off small.
Do you think starting off as a mod makes it more of like a labor of love, and do you think that the audience can understand that, or they receive that?
Yeah, but I don't think it's a drawing point for that, because I don't think players will play a game because, oh, this guy, it's a labor of love, so I'm going to play it for him. Most gamers aren't that generous. They're they have very few time, man.
If your grandma bakes you cookies, like, you can taste the love in the cookies, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can taste it yourself if it's your grandma, but other gamers, they're like, that's not my grandma. I mean,
if you share your cookies with those gamers,
yeah, but trust me, those gamers, they don't give a shit about your grandma, man. No, trust me. I know it sounds very sentimental. Your grandma's baking cookies, but yeah, I trust me. A lot of gamers these days. I mean, it's like, you know, I don't have a connection to the developer. I'm only gonna play that game for as long as that game entertains me. So that's why I think game like mods, they sound very like, you know, sentimental and very from the heart. But honestly, they grow because they grow. Because the developer is so in touch with the community and he listens to the community.
It's just about making a good game.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with grandma's cookies. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I had just one last question for you about this FPS and kind of where it's at right now, because you know your history really revolves around multiplayer games. Yeah. And we're seeing Call of Duty recently did not ship with a campaign.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the state of single? Did you ever get into playing single player FPS back in the day?
Yeah, I still play a few. I love them, like Far Cry 4.
Do you think there's still a place for that?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the reason like Call of Duty focused more on the single player, on that multiplayer, I think it was just kind of a, you know, I don't want to, I don't want to assume, but I'm just kind of like, if I had to guess, for me, I think they just sort of felt they wanted to do something that was cheaper, you know, because it costs much less to make a multiplayer game compared to a single player game. I mean, your development costs get cut probably by a third.
Yeah, I think they ended up just adding multiple multiplayer.
Yeah, it's much cheaper. It's much cheaper. And the payoff is better. I mean, the payoff is greater because you know, they realize, oh, most of the players just play it just for the multiplayer. And now that they can sell skins, they can generate much more revenue by just making a multiplayer game. So that's why you're starting to see more game companies kind of focus on the multiplayer, because it's just cheaper from a bottom line standpoint.
So it's definitely higher margin than making
it's definitely higher margin. Yeah, so
unless you have like a banger like Doom or something that can
Yeah. I mean, like when you look at games like Doom, I think one of the reasons why Bethesda is able to make Doom a single-player game is Doom is such a old IP. It's such a established IP that they have a very huge player base, and you know, they don't have to do as much marketing, so they can. So you still have these large IPs that I do believe have the capacity to make single-player games, and and drive enough players to play them so that it becomes financially viable for them to do that. But for like indie developers to make single player games, I don't know. I think financially it's much more involving, and the rate of return is lower. When you look at a game like The Division 2, which some people kind of look at as single player but also multiplayer as well, it has kind of aspects of both, right? So I think the reason that they kept the multiplayer aspect is to keep the player base engaged. So you still have a lot of players playing it for a long period of time, even though it does have a single player component. I think they want players to continue to play it even after they've beaten the game.
And a lot of these games, not necessarily just
so basically, they've kind of just lengthened the long tail of the player time engagement. Because usually, if a player plays a single player game, he's done within 20 minutes or 20 hours, right? Or at most, maybe 10 hours, right? But when you look at a game like The Division, the long tail of it is probably like on average 60 hours, right? So if you've got players playing that much longer, they're engaged more and they're more likely to buy cosmetics and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I think the days of seeing traditional single-player games only like Half-Life, where it's kind of like, 10 hours and that kind of stuff.
So just to wrap up, your advice to, let's say there's an indie dev out there, this is GDC, they might even come to your talk.
Oh, okay.
And they want to make an FPS game. Your advice would be, don't bring up grandma's cookies and what else?
Kind of try to think about the longevity of your game, because in this day and age, player engagement is so important. You want players to stay engaged to your game for as long as possible. Which it's difficult because of just the competitive nature of what we live in these days. You have to keep players engaged for as long as possible.
Yep, with awesome emotes.
So basically, update your game, like add new content to it on a regular basis.